The fluorescent lights of County General Hospital seemed to buzz louder than usual as Tom Chen made his way down the stark white hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last. 3 days ago, his mom had gone in for what they thought was just a routine checkup. Now the words Stage 3 and aggressive treatment hung in the air around him like smoke that wouldn't clear. Tom hadn't slept properly since the diagnosis. His eyes burned from exhaustion, and his stomach twisted into knots that no amount of hospital cafeteria coffee could untangle. He needed a moment away from the beeping machines and the sympathetic glances from nurses who had seen this story play out hundreds of times before. "There's a chapel down the hall if you need some quiet," one of the nurses had mentioned earlier, pointing vaguely toward the east wing. Tom wasn't religious, hadn't been to church since his grandmother's funeral when he was 12, but right now, any space without the antiseptic smell and fluorescent glare seemed like a sanctuary. The chapel door was heavier than it looked, solid oak that opened with a soft creak. Inside, the room was dimly lit with gentle wall sconces and a few flickering electric candles. The space was small but peaceful, just 3 short rows of wooden benches and a simple altar with no specific religious symbols, designed to welcome people of all faiths or none at all. Tom slipped into the back row, surprised to find he was not alone. On the far side of the front row sat an elderly man, his shoulders hunched forward, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The man wasn't praying out loud, but his body seemed to tremble slightly with each breath. Tom sat quietly, not wanting to disturb the other visitor. He closed his eyes and tried to organize his thoughts. His mom had always been the strong one in the family. After his dad left when Tom was 10, she had worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. She never complained, even when her hands were raw from cleaning houses all day before starting her night shift at the grocery store. "You just keep moving forward," she always told him. "That's the only direction worth going." And she had pushed him forward too. Through college applications, through his teaching certification, through the rejection letters from publishers who didn't think his short stories were marketable enough. Now, at 24, he was finally finding his footing as a part-time English teacher, still dreaming of seeing his name on the cover of a book someday, but none of that mattered if his mom wasn't there to see it happen. A soft, choked sound broke through Tom's thoughts. The elderly man was crying. Not loudly, but with the kind of deep sorrow that comes from a wound too profound for words. Tom shifted uncomfortably on the bench. Should he leave to give the man privacy? Should he pretend not to notice? Before he could decide, something his mother once said floated through his mind. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is reach out when someone's drowning. Even if you don't know how to swim yourself. Tom stood up. His legs seemed to move on their own as he walked to the front row and sat down beside the elderly man, leaving just enough space between them to be respectful. Up close, he could see the man's worn sport coat, once expensive but now frayed at the cuffs. His hands were weathered, with prominent veins and age spots, but they had a certain dignity to them, hands that had worked hard and helped others. The man didn't look up or acknowledge Tom's presence. His eyes remained fixed on the altar ahead, tears silently tracking down deeply lined cheeks into a neatly trimmed white beard. "I'm not very good at this," Tom said softly, gesturing vaguely around the chapel. "I don't really know what I'm supposed to say or do in here, but it seems like maybe you're going through something really tough too." The man's breathing hitched slightly, but he remained silent. "My mom always says that burdens are lighter when they're shared," Tom continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know you and you don't know me, but we're both here for a reason, right?" Finally, the elderly man turned to look at Tom. His eyes were pale blue and clouded with cataracts, but they held a sharp intelligence beneath the grief. "My wife of 53 years, he said, his voice cracking. "She's down the hall in hospice care. The doctors say it's a matter of days now." "I'm so sorry," Tom replied, and he meant it. His own worry suddenly seemed smaller in comparison, though he knew pain wasn't a competition. 53 years, the man repeated. "We met when we were 20. I was in medical school. She was studying to be a nurse. We've never been apart more than a week since then." He paused, swallowing hard. "I don't know how to be in this world without her." Without thinking, Tom reached over and took the man's hand. It felt cool and fragile in his grip, but after a moment of surprise, the elderly man's fingers curled around his with surprising strength. "My name's Tom," he said. "My mom was diagnosed with cancer 3 days ago. I came in here because I didn't know where else to go. David, the man replied. David Walsh. They sat in silence for a moment, two strangers connected by shared pain and clasped hands in a quiet hospital chapel. Would it be okay if I prayed with you? Tom asked, surprising himself with the question. Like I said, I'm not very good at it, but maybe we could try together? David looked at Tom with an expression of such raw gratitude that it made Tom's throat tighten. I would like that very much, David said. I've been sitting here for an hour trying to find the right words, but they won't come. Tom took a deep breath and closed his eyes. He had no idea what he was doing, but something told him it didn't matter, that the act itself was what counted. I don't know who's listening, he began hesitantly, but if anyone is, we could use some help down here. David's wife has been his partner for over 50 years, and my mom is the strongest person I know. They both deserve more time, more joy, more everything. But if that's not possible, then maybe we're the ones who need help, to be brave enough to face whatever comes next, to be there for them the way they've always been there for us. Tom paused, feeling self-conscious, but David's hand squeezed his encouragingly. And if there is something after this, Tom continued, please make it beautiful, make it peaceful, make it a place where pain doesn't exist anymore, and let them know somehow that they were loved beyond words while they were here, that they made a difference, that they mattered. Tom's voice broke on the last word, and he felt tears sliding down his own cheeks now. Beside him, David was crying too, but the quality of his tears seemed different. Less desperate, more cleansing. Thank you, David whispered when Tom fell silent. That was exactly right. They sat together for a while longer, not speaking, just existing in the shared space of grief and hope. The chapel remained quiet around them, a small island of stillness in the bustling hospital. Eventually, a gentle knock on the door broke the silence. A nurse poked her head in. Dr. Walsh, your wife is asking for you. David nodded and slowly got to his feet. Tom stood too, suddenly aware that he'd been holding an elderly stranger's hand while crying in a hospital chapel. But there was no embarrassment in the moment, only a strange sense of connection. Will you be here tomorrow? David asked, pausing at the chapel door. Yes, Tom said without hesitation. Same time? Same time, David agreed, the ghost of a smile briefly lighting his tired face. I'll bring coffee. Hospital coffee is terrible, and I say that as someone who practically lived on it for 40 years. As David left with the nurse, Tom sank back onto the bench. His mother's condition hadn't changed. The fear and uncertainty were still there, but somehow the weight of it all felt slightly easier to bear. He looked down at his hand, the one that had held David's, and marveled at how such a simple, instinctive gesture could create such a profound connection between two strangers. He couldn't have known then that this moment, this single act of human kindness, would be the first thread in a tapestry that would eventually change the course of his life forever. For now, though he simply sat in the quiet chapel, gathering his strength to return to his mother's room, carrying with him the small comfort of a shared prayer and the promise of tomorrow's coffee with a new friend who understood exactly what it meant to be afraid of losing someone you couldn't imagine living without. The next afternoon, Tom found himself checking the time every few minutes as he sat beside his mother's hospital bed. She was sleeping, her face peaceful despite the dark circles under her eyes and the new hollowness in her cheeks. The chemotherapy would start tomorrow, and the doctors had warned it would be rough. For now, though, her breathing was steady, and Tom was grateful for small mercies. At 10 minutes to 4, he gently squeezed his mother's hand. I'll be back in a bit, Mom, he whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear him. Just going to the chapel for a while. The hall seemed less intimidating today. Tom had spent enough time in the hospital now that he was starting to recognize some of the staff. The janitor who always nodded hello, the young nurse with colorful cartoon characters on her scrubs, the tired-looking resident who somehow managed to smile for every patient. The hospital was becoming less of a scary foreign land and more of a temporary home, for better or worse. When Tom pushed open the chapel door, David was already there, sitting in the same spot as yesterday. 2 paper cups of coffee sat on the bench beside him. Right on time, David said, looking up with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes but showed genuine effort. He looked even more tired than yesterday, if that was possible, but he'd changed his clothes, a fresh button-up shirt under a cardigan that had seen better days. Thanks for the coffee, Tom said, sitting down and accepting the cup David handed him. The warmth felt good against his palms. "How's your wife today?" David took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "Linda's having a good day, all things considered. She was awake for almost 2 hours this morning. We talked about our honeymoon in Cape Cod. She remembered every detail, right down to the awful floral wallpaper in our rental cottage." His voice wavered slightly. "The lucid moments are a gift, but they're getting fewer and farther between." Tom nodded, unsure what to say but wanting David to know he was listening. "And your mother?" David asked. "Starts chemo tomorrow," Tom replied. "The doctors seem optimistic, but they also talk about managing expectations, which is terrifying in its own way." David nodded knowingly. "Doctors speak their own language. I should know, I used it for 40 years. We say managing expectations when we want to be hopeful, but don't want to make promises we can't keep." "You were a doctor?" Tom asked, surprised. "Family medicine. Retired 5 years ago." David's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Though Linda would tell you I never really retired. Just traded paid work for volunteer work." As they sipped their coffee, David shared stories about his career. He and Linda had run a clinic in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods for most of their working lives, often treating patients who couldn't pay with the understanding that they would help someone else when they could. "We called it the circle of care," David explained. "You don't always give back to the person who helped you. Sometimes you just pass it forward to whoever needs it next." Tom found himself telling David about his own life in return, his job teaching high school English, his small apartment filled with books, his dreams of becoming a published writer someday. "I have a drawer full of rejection letters," Tom admitted. "My mom keeps telling me to frame them as proof I'm trying, but it's hard not to take each one personally." "What do you write about?" David asked, seeming genuinely interested. "People, mostly. Everyday moments that change lives in ways no one expects." Tom shrugged, feeling self-conscious. "Probably sounds pretentious." "Not at all," David said firmly. "Those moments are everything. Like us meeting here, for instance." They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that usually only exists between old friends. For a few minutes, they weren't a young teacher and a retired doctor. They were just two people taking shelter in the same port during similar storms. "Would you like to pray again today?" Tom asked eventually. David nodded. "I would. Yesterday was the first time since Linda's diagnosis that I felt, I don't know, less alone, I suppose." This time their prayer was less hesitant. Tom's words flowed more naturally as they held hands in the quiet chapel, asking for strength, for peace, for the ability to be present for the people they loved even when it hurt to see them suffering. The daily chapel visits quickly became a ritual. Sometimes they talked for the full hour, sharing stories and worries. Other times they sat in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts but drawing comfort from each other's presence. They always ended with a prayer, hands clasped together. As days turned into weeks, Tom's mother began the grueling journey through chemotherapy. Some days were better than others. On the good days, they played cards and watched her favorite cooking shows, pretending not to notice when she fell asleep mid-episode. On the bad days, Tom read to her while she was too sick to lift her head, choosing chapters from the books she'd read to him as a child. Meanwhile, Linda's condition continued to decline. David spoke of her less and less during their chapel meetings. Not because he didn't want to share, but because words seemed increasingly inadequate to express what was happening. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Tom arrived at the chapel to find it empty. He waited for half an hour, growing increasingly worried before heading to the hospice wing to look for David. He found him sitting beside Linda's bed, holding her frail hand. She was asleep or unconscious, Tom couldn't tell which, her breathing shallow and irregular. David looked up when Tom appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of exhaustion and grief. "I'm sorry I missed our meeting," David said softly. "Don't apologize," Tom replied, hesitating at the threshold. "I can go if you want to be alone." "No, please stay," David said, gesturing to the empty chair on the other side of the bed. "Linda always wanted to meet you. I've told her all about our talks." Tom entered the room slowly and sat down, feeling like an intruder in this most private of moments. But David seemed genuinely grateful for his presence. "She was a pediatric nurse when we met," David said, gazing at his wife's face. "The children adored her. She could calm even the most frightened child with just her voice. I fell in love watching her bandage a little boy's knee while telling him a story about brave nights that made him forget all about his scrape." Tom looked at Linda. Her silver hair spread across the pillow. Her skin nearly translucent, the gentle rise and fall of her chest barely visible. He tried to imagine her as the young nurse in David's story, vibrant and full of life. "What's happening with your mother's treatment?" David asked after a while, clearly wanting to focus on something else even briefly. "The doctors are cautiously optimistic," Tom said. "The tumor is responding to treatment. But she's so tired all the time and she's lost so much weight." David nodded. "The cure can feel worse than the disease sometimes. But she sounds like a fighter." "She is," Tom agreed. "Always has been." They sat together through the afternoon, David occasionally moistening Linda's lips with a small sponge, Tom stepping out only briefly to call his neighbor who was checking on his mother. As evening approached, a hospice nurse came in to check Linda's vitals. She greeted David warmly. They were clearly well acquainted by now and gave Tom a kind smile. "You should get some rest, Dr. Walsh," she said gently. "You've been here since dawn." David shook his head. "I'll stay a bit longer." When the nurse left, Tom stood up. "I should go check on my mom, but I can come back afterward if you'd like company." "You're a good man, Tom," David said, looking up at him with tired eyes. "Thank you for today, and for all the days in the chapel." "That's what friends do," Tom replied simply. As he walked back to his mother's room, Tom realized that was exactly what they had become. Friends. Despite the 40-year age difference, despite meeting in the worst of circumstances. Somehow, in the sterile environment of a hospital where most people felt anonymous and alone, they had found a genuine connection. His mother was awake when he returned, looking stronger than she had in days. "Where were you?" she asked, putting down the magazine she'd been flipping through. Tom hesitated, then told her about David and Linda, about their daily meetings in the chapel, about the afternoon he'd just spent in the hospice room. His mother listened without interrupting, her eyes growing soft. When he finished, she reached for his hand. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "For what?" "All I did was sit with him." She shook her head slightly as if he was missing something obvious. Sometimes sitting with someone is the hardest thing in the world to do. And the most important. Tom thought about David, still sitting beside his wife's bed, keeping vigil as her life ebbed away. He thought about their prayers in the chapel, their shared coffee, their conversations about everything and nothing. He thought about how, just a few weeks ago, they had been complete strangers to each other. "I never expected to make a friend here," Tom admitted. His mother smiled weakly. "Life has a funny way of giving you exactly what you need, exactly when you need it. Even in the hardest times, maybe especially then." 3 days later, Tom's phone rang at 5:17 in the morning. He fumbled for it in the dark, his heart immediately racing with the kind of fear that only middle-of-the-night calls can bring. "Hello?" he answered, his voice thick with sleep. "Tom, it's David." The old doctor's voice was steady but hollow. "Linda passed away about an hour ago. I thought you should know." Tom sat up, instantly awake. "I'm so sorry, David. Was she in pain?" "No," David said softly. "She went peacefully. I was holding her hand." The simplicity of those words hit Tom hard. He thought about all their conversations in the chapel, all the prayers they'd shared, and how often David had spoken about wanting just that, for Linda to have a gentle passing. "Is there anything I can do?" Tom asked, already reaching for his jeans. "Actually, yes," David replied. "The hospital staff needs me to handle some paperwork, and then they'll be taking her away. I could use a friend." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Tom promised. The hospital hallways were eerily quiet in the pre-dawn hours. Tom made his way to the hospice wing, where he found David sitting in a chair outside Linda's room. He looked smaller somehow, as if grief had physically compressed him. Without a word, Tom sat beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. They stayed that way for several minutes before David spoke. 53 years, he said, his voice barely audible. "We built a life together, raised a son, treated thousands of patients. And now I'm supposed to just continue. How does one do that?" Tom had no answer, so he simply squeezed David's shoulder. Sometimes presence mattered more than words. A staff member approached with forms for David to sign. Tom waited patiently, then walked with David to the parking lot when everything was finished. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds that seemed inappropriate for such a sad morning. "The funeral will be on Saturday," David said as they reached his car. "Would you come? You didn't know Linda, but she knew about you. I'd like you to be there. Of course, Tom nodded. Just tell me when and where. The next few days passed in a blur. Tom divided his time between the hospital, where his mother continued her treatment, and helping David with funeral arrangements. He picked up the programs from the printer, ordered flowers, and sat with David in his living room as he received occasional visitors, mostly former colleagues and patients who had heard the news. David's house was exactly what Tom had imagined. A modest two-story in an older neighborhood, filled with books and photographs and the comfortable clutter of a long, well-lived life. Every surface held evidence of Linda, her gardening magazine stacked neatly on the coffee table, her knitting basket still beside her favorite chair, her handwriting on the calendar hanging in the kitchen. On Friday afternoon, Tom arrived to find David sorting through photo albums for the memorial display. "My son Peter is flying in tonight," David mentioned, as Tom helped arrange photographs on a corkboard. "Haven't seen him in almost 2 years." 2 years? Tom couldn't hide his surprise. That's a long time. David's hand stilled on a wedding photo from the 1970s, Linda radiant in a simple white dress, flowers in her hair. "Peter and we've had our differences. He wanted us to sell the practice and retire to Florida years ago. Couldn't understand why we stayed in the neighborhood when it started going downhill." He placed the photo carefully on the board. "He never quite forgave me for putting our patients ahead of profits, or for sending him to public school instead of the private academies his friends attended. He thought we were short-sighting his future. Maybe we were. What does he do now?" Tom asked, genuinely curious about the son of this man he'd come to care about so deeply. "He's an editor at Meridian Publishing in New York. Very successful." There was pride in David's voice. Despite everything, Linda spoke to him more regularly than I did. She was better at keeping the peace. That evening, Tom went back to the hospital to spend time with his mother. Her latest scans showed improvement. The tumor was shrinking, but the treatments left her exhausted and fragile. Still, her spirit remained unbroken. "How's your friend doing?" she asked as Tom adjusted her pillows. "Not great," Tom admitted. "The funeral is tomorrow. His son is coming in tonight, but they're not close. I'm worried about him." His mother reached for his hand. "Then it's good he has you." The funeral was held at a small community church where Linda had volunteered. The wooden pews filled quickly. Far more people than Tom had expected. Medical colleagues, former patients, neighbors, friends from church and community organizations. Linda, it seemed, had touched countless lives. Tom sat in the second row, directly behind David and a tall, impeccably dressed man who could only be Peter. From the stiffness in their postures, Tom could tell their reunion had been awkward at best. The service was simple but deeply moving. Several people spoke about Linda's kindness, her dedication to helping others, her quiet strength. When it was David's turn, he spoke with remarkable composure about their life together and the legacy of love she left behind. At the reception afterward, Tom hung back, helping to serve coffee and making sure David ate something. Peter stood in a corner, accepting condolences from a steady stream of people but looking increasingly uncomfortable. Near the end of the reception, Tom was stacking used plates when Peter approached him. "You must be Tom," he said, extending his hand. "Dad mentioned you've been helping him this week. I appreciate that." Up close, Peter looked even more polished. Expensive suit, designer glasses, the kind of haircut that probably cost more than Tom's weekly grocery budget. But his eyes were red-rimmed, and beneath his composed exterior, grief was clearly taking its toll. "I'm sorry for your loss," Tom said sincerely, shaking his hand. "Your mother sounds like she was an amazing woman." "She was," Peter agreed, his voice catching slightly. "Better than I deserved, honestly. I should have visited more often." The raw honesty of the admission surprised Tom. "I think she knew you loved her." "That's what matters." Peter studied Tom's face. "How do you know my father exactly?" He wasn't very clear on the phone. Tom hesitated, realizing how strange their connection might sound. "We met in the hospital chapel. My mom is being treated for cancer there. Your dad and we sort of helped each other through some hard days." Understanding dawned in Peter's eyes. "You're the one who prayed with him." He mentioned that. He glanced across the room to where David was speaking with an elderly couple. "Thank you for that. Dad hasn't been to church in years, not since—" He trailed off. "Not since what?" Tom asked gently. Peter sighed. "Not since my younger brother died. Ryan was only 12, leukemia. Dad was a doctor but couldn't save his own son. I think that's when he lost his faith. He shook his head slightly. But that's ancient history now. Before Tom could respond, one of the church ladies called Peter away to sign something. Tom watched him go, piecing together this new information about David's past. There was so much he still didn't know about his friend. Later, as the last guests were leaving, Tom found David sitting alone in a pew, staring at the photo of Linda displayed on an easel near the altar. "Ready to go home?" Tom asked quietly. David looked up with tired eyes. "Not really, but I suppose I have to eventually." As they walked to the parking lot, David said, "Peter's going back to New York tomorrow. Work emergency he can't postpone, apparently." The disappointment in his voice was palpable. "That's too bad," Tom said carefully. "You two haven't had much time together." "Story of our relationship," David replied with a sad smile. "Always something more important than family." He stopped beside his car. "Would you mind coming over tomorrow? The house is going to feel very empty." "Of course," Tom promised. "I'll bring lunch." The next day, Tom arrived at David's house to find him and Peter in the middle of what appeared to be a heated discussion. They fell silent when Tom knocked on the open door, both looking slightly embarrassed. "Sorry to interrupt," Tom said awkwardly. "I can come back later." "No, please stay," David insisted. Peter was just leaving for the airport anyway. Peter grabbed his coat, his jaw tight with unresolved tension. But at the door he paused and turned back to his father. "Think about what I said, Dad. Please. Mom would have wanted you to take care of yourself now." After Peter left, David sank into his armchair with a heavy sigh. "He wants me to sell the house, move into a retirement community. Says it's not safe for me to live alone at my age." "What do you want?" Tom asked, setting down the bag of sandwiches he'd brought. David looked around the room at the walls covered with a lifetime of memories. "I want to stay here as long as I can. This is where Linda and I built our life. I'm not ready to pack it away into boxes." Tom nodded, understanding completely. "Then that's what you should tell him." "I did," David said with a faint smile. "Rather forcefully, I'm afraid. Poor timing on my part." They ate lunch together, talking about safer topics. Tom's mother's improving condition, a book David was reading, a funny incident with a squirrel in David's bird feeder that morning. But Tom could see the sadness and exhaustion etched deep in his friend's face. "You know," Tom said as he was leaving, "I can stop by regularly, check in on you. My mom's treatments are going to keep me at the hospital almost daily anyway." Relief flickered across David's features. "I'd like that. And maybe we could still meet in the chapel sometimes? I find I miss our talks there." "Absolutely," Tom agreed. "Same time tomorrow?" As he drove back to the hospital, Tom thought about the unexpected turn his life had taken. A month ago, he'd been just another worried son in a hospital waiting room. Now he was deeply involved in the life of a grieving widower old enough to be his grandfather. Neither of them could have possibly imagined that first day in the chapel, how important they would become to each other. One simple gesture, reaching out to hold a stranger's hand in prayer, had created a connection that was now helping them both navigate some of the darkest waters of their lives. The weeks following, Linda's funeral fell into a new rhythm. Tom divided his time between the hospital, where his mother continued her treatments with cautious optimism from her doctors, and David's house, where he checked in every other day. Their chapel meetings continued as well, though the prayers had shifted, now focusing more on gratitude for Tom's mother's improving condition and for the memories David cherished of Linda. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Tom arrived at David's house to find him sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by stacks of papers, looking more overwhelmed than Tom had ever seen him. "Spring cleaning?" Tom asked, shaking raindrops from his jacket. David looked up with tired eyes. "Linda always handled our paperwork. Insurance, bills, investments, all of it. I'm embarrassed to admit I barely know where to begin." Tom hung his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. "Let me help. I'm no financial expert, but two heads are better than one, right?" For the next few hours, they sorted through the paperwork, creating piles for bills, medical documents, insurance policies, and miscellaneous items that needed attention. Tom was surprised to discover that despite their modest lifestyle, the Walshes had managed their money remarkably well over the years. Linda was always the practical one, David explained as they found yet another well-maintained investment account. She grew up poor. Her father lost everything in the recession of the 50s. She was determined we'd never be financially vulnerable. As they worked, David shared more stories about Linda, how she'd put herself through nursing school working nights at a diner, how she'd insisted they live well below their means so they could help others, how she'd tracked every penny but never hesitated to give generously when someone was in need. "Your clinic must have been special," Tom commented, sorting another stack of papers. "To help so many people who couldn't pay." David smiled, the memories bringing momentary light to his grief-worn face. "We had a sliding scale. Those who could pay full price did. Those who couldn't paid what they could, sometimes just a few dollars, sometimes by helping around the clinic. Some of our patients fixed our plumbing. Others brought vegetables from their gardens." His eyes grew distant. "Medicine has changed so much. Everything's corporate now, insurance-driven. The human element gets lost." Around dinner time, Tom ordered pizza and they took a break from the paperwork. As they ate, David suddenly stood up and disappeared into the study, returning with a manila envelope. "I've been meaning to give you this," he said, placing it on the table between them. "It's for you, but I don't want you to open it yet." Tom wiped his hands on a napkin and picked up the envelope curiously. It was sealed and had some weight to it. "What is it?" "Just something Linda and I had discussed," David said vaguely. "You'll know when it's the right time to open it." Tom wanted to ask more questions, but something in David's expression stopped him. Instead, he tucked the envelope into his bag with a nod. "Thank you. I'll keep it safe." The following day brought unexpected news at the hospital. Tom's mother's latest scan showed significant improvement. The tumor had shrunk dramatically and her blood work was trending in the right direction. "Does this mean she's going to be okay?" Tom asked the oncologist, hardly daring to hope. "We need to complete the full course of treatment," the doctor cautioned. "But yes, we're very encouraged by her response. If things continue this way, her prognosis is excellent." Tom felt lightheaded with relief. He called David immediately, and the old doctor's joy was palpable even over the phone. "That's wonderful news," David said warmly. "Truly wonderful. We should celebrate. Bring her over for dinner when she feels up to it. I make a mean pot roast, one of the few dishes Linda trusted me to cook without supervision." The invitation touched Tom deeply. The idea of his two worlds connecting, his mother and his unexpected friend, felt right somehow, like completing a circle. But life rarely follows the paths we imagine. 3 days later, Tom arrived at David's house for their regular visit to find no answer at the door. Concerned, he used the spare key David had given him for emergencies and let himself in. "David?" he called, moving through the quiet house. "It's Tom, are you here?" A faint sound from upstairs drew his attention. He climbed the stairs and found David sitting on the edge of his bed, pale and disoriented, trying unsuccessfully to put on his shoes. "I don't feel quite right," David admitted when he saw Tom. "Thought I could make it to the doctor on my own. But—" He gestured weakly at his half-tied shoes. Tom was at his side instantly, noticing the sweat beading on David's forehead and the strange grayish tint to his skin. "How long have you felt like this?" "Started last night," David said, his breathing labored. "Thought it was just indigestion." Tom recognized the signs from the heart health posters plastered all over the hospital. Without wasting time, he called 911, then helped David lie back on the bed while they waited for the ambulance. "Just breathe slowly," Tom urged, holding David's hand the way they had done so many times in the chapel. "Help is coming." David's eyes, cloudy with pain, found Tom's. "If anything happens to me, don't talk like that," Tom interrupted firmly. "You're going to be fine. Let me finish," David insisted, his grip tightening on Tom's hand. "If anything happens, the envelope I gave you, that's when you open it. And call Peter. His number is in my address book in the kitchen drawer." The next few hours passed in a blur of sirens, emergency room chaos, and tense waiting. Tom called his mother from the hospital to explain what was happening, then settled in the cardiac unit waiting room, determined not to leave until he knew David was stable. Around midnight, a doctor finally emerged to speak with him. "Mr. Walsh had a moderate heart attack," she explained, looking tired but not overly concerned. "We've placed a stent to open the blocked artery. He's stable now and resting. Are you family?" "No," Tom admitted, "but I'm all he has right now. His son lives out of state." The doctor nodded, seemingly satisfied. "He's asking for you. You can see him briefly. but he needs rest. David looked small and vulnerable in the hospital bed, hooked up to monitors and an IV, but his eyes brightened when Tom entered the room. "There he is," David said weakly. "My guardian angel." Tom pulled a chair close to the bed. "You scared me half to death." "Only half? I must be losing my touch," David joked, though the effort clearly cost him. After a moment, his expression grew serious. "Thank you for finding me. The doctor said if I'd waited much longer. I'm just glad I came by when I did," Tom said, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Have they called Peter yet?" David nodded slightly. "He's catching the first flight out tomorrow morning." He paused, seeming to gather his strength. "Did you bring the envelope?" Tom shook his head. "It's still at home. You told me not to open it yet, remember?" "Good," David murmured, his eyelids growing heavy. "Not time yet." A nurse appeared in the doorway, tapping her watch meaningfully. Tom stood, giving David's hand one last squeeze. "Get some rest. I'll be back first thing tomorrow." The next day, Tom arrived at the hospital to find Peter already there, looking tired and rumpled from his red-eye flight. Their greeting was awkward but less tense than at the funeral. "Dad told me what happened," Peter said as they walked to the cafeteria for coffee. "How you found him and called the ambulance." "You probably saved his life," Tom shrugged uncomfortably. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Peter said firmly. "Not anyone would check on an elderly neighbor regularly or know what to do in that situation." He stirred his coffee absently. "I should have been there. Should have visited more often." "He understands you have your own life," Tom offered. "Your own responsibilities." Peter's laugh was hollow. "That's generous of you. Truth is, I've been a lousy son. Put my career ahead of family for years." He looked directly at Tom. "Dad mentioned you're a writer." The abrupt change of subject caught Tom off guard. "Trying to be. I teach high school English to pay the bills." "What do you write?" Peter asked, seeming genuinely interested. "Short stories mostly, about ordinary people and moments that change their lives." Tom felt self-conscious discussing his writing with someone who worked in publishing. "Nothing that's caught any publisher's attention yet." Peter nodded thoughtfully. "Send me something sometime. I'm always looking for new voices." Tom nearly choked on his coffee. "You're serious?" "Completely," Peter confirmed. "Dad thinks highly of you. That counts for something." Before Tom could respond, a doctor approached their table. "Mr. Walsh, your father is asking for both of you." They found David sitting up in bed, looking remarkably better than the previous night. The color had returned to his face, and though he was clearly weak, his eyes were alert and focused. "My two favorite people in the same room," he said with a smile. "Quite the improvement from yesterday." Tom hung back as Peter hugged his father carefully, noticing the way both men held on a beat longer than necessary, as if making up for lost time. When they separated, David gestured for Tom to come closer. "The doctors say I need to take it easy for a while," David explained. "No living alone for at least a few weeks." "I've been looking into home health care options," Peter began, but David shook his head. "Actually, I've been thinking," he said slowly. "Maybe it is time for a change. Not a retirement home," he added quickly, seeing Peter's expression, "but perhaps selling the house. Finding somewhere smaller, more manageable." Peter looked stunned. "Really? You were so adamant about staying." David's eyes found Tom's. "Someone wise once told me that our loved ones live on in our hearts, not in our possessions. The house is full of memories, but Linda is with me wherever I go." Tom recognized his own words, spoken to David during one of their chapel meetings. The fact that they had made such an impression left him momentarily speechless. "Besides," David continued with a hint of his old humor, "all those stairs were going to kill me one way or another." The three of them spent the afternoon discussing possibilities: condominiums near the hospital, apartments in Peter's neighborhood in New York, even a small cottage near the coast that Linda had always loved. No decisions were made, but for the first time, doors seemed to be opening rather than closing. As visiting hours ended, David asked Tom to stay behind for a moment. "There's something I want you to know," he said once Peter had stepped out. "Whatever happens next, meeting you was no accident." "What do you mean?" Tom asked. David's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "The day we met in the chapel, I was in the darkest plendoir. See, I'd ever been. Linda's condition was worsening, and I felt completely alone. I went to the chapel not to pray, I gave that up long ago, but because I didn't know where else to go." He reached for Tom's hand. And then you sat down beside me, took my hand, prayed with me, a complete stranger offering exactly what I needed in that moment. Tom felt his own eyes growing damp. You helped me just as much. That's how it works, David said softly. The circle of care, remember? Now it's your turn to help someone else when they need it most. As Tom walked to his mother's room on another floor of the hospital, he felt the weight of the still unopened envelope in his bag. Whatever it contained, he sensed it would be yet another unexpected turn in this strange, beautiful journey that had begun with one simple gesture in a hospital chapel. 1 year later, Tom stood at the podium of a small bookstore, looking out at the crowd gathered for his very first book signing. His mother sat in the front row, healthy and vibrant again, her hair grown back in soft silver curls. Beside her sat David, now living in a sunny condominium just 10 minutes from Tom's apartment. Thank you all for coming tonight, Tom began, his voice steady despite his nerves. This book wouldn't exist without the people in this room, especially two who changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. As he spoke about his collection of short stories, tales of ordinary people, connecting in extraordinary moments, his mind drifted back to the events that had unfolded over the past year. David had recovered remarkably well from his heart attack, though the experience had indeed prompted significant changes. With Peter's help, he had sold the family home and moved into a one-level condominium in a building with an elevator and security. The new place was smaller but filled with carefully chosen mementos of his life with Linda. Peter had visited more frequently after David's health scare, their relationship gradually healing with each conversation. During one of these visits, Peter had asked to read some of Tom's writing. To Tom's shock, Peter had called him 2 weeks later. "This is good," Peter had said bluntly. "Really good. With some editing, I think Meridian might be interested." What followed was months of revisions, late-night phone calls with Peter, and finally, an offer from Meridian Publishing for Tom's collection of interconnected short stories. The book, titled Strangers in Prayer, centered around unexpected connections between people in life's most difficult moments. And through it all, the envelope David had given Tom remained sealed, tucked away in his desk drawer. "Not time yet," David would say whenever Tom asked about it. "You'll know when." After the book signing, as the crowd thinned and the bookstore staff began cleaning up, Tom's mother embraced him tightly. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Your father would have been too." The mention of his father, gone for so many years now, caught Tom by surprise. "You think so?" She nodded firmly. "He always said you had stories to tell. He just didn't live long enough to see you tell them." As his mother went to chat with some neighbors who had attended the event, David approached Tom with a small, wrapped package. "A publication gift," he explained, handing it to Tom. "Though not nearly as meaningful as the one you've given me." "What do you mean?" Tom asked, carefully unwrapping the package to reveal a beautiful leather-bound journal. David gestured around the bookstore. "All of this. Watching you succeed. Being part of your journey." His eyes, still sharp despite his age, held Tom steadily. "When Linda died, I thought my purpose in life had ended too. But then there was you reminding me that connections don't end. They evolve, they grow in unexpected ways." Tom swallowed hard. "I wouldn't be here without you and Peter." "Oh, I think you would," David countered with a smile. "Maybe just by a different path." He paused, seeming to consider something important. "I think it's time for you to open that envelope now." Tom's heart skipped. "You're sure?" David nodded. "Tonight feels right. Why don't you come by tomorrow morning? We can open it together." That night, Tom barely slept, wondering what could be in the envelope that had remained such a mystery for so long. The next morning, he arrived at David's condominium with coffee and pastries, finding the older man already up and dressed, sitting at his kitchen table. "Good morning," David greeted him cheerfully. "Successful authors still bring breakfast, I see." Tom laughed, setting down the coffee cups. Some things never change. They chatted about the book signing as they ate, David asking detailed questions about the turnout and Tom's experience speaking in public. Finally, when they'd finished their pastries, Tom pulled the now-worn manila envelope from his bag. "So," he said, placing it on the table between them. "The great mystery," David nodded, suddenly solemn. "Before you open it, there's something I need to explain." He took a deep breath. "The day we met in the chapel when you sat down and held my hand, That wasn't just kindness to a stranger. That was the moment I started to believe in humanity again. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. After our son Ryan died, I was angry at the world, at God, at the unfairness of it all. I was a doctor who couldn't save his own child. Linda held on to her faith, but I couldn't. For years, I went through the motions, caring for patients, living my life, but inside something was broken. Tom listened silently, understanding now why their chapel meetings had meant so much to David. When Linda was diagnosed, David continued, all that old anger came rushing back. But then there you were, this young man with his own burdens reaching out to a stranger in pain. His voice grew husky with emotion. You reminded me that goodness still exists in this world, that connections between people are what make life bearable in its darkest moments. He gestured to the envelope. Linda and I had already been discussing what to do with our savings. We have more than enough for my needs, and Peter is well established in his career. When I told Linda about you, your kindness, your writing dreams, she knew immediately what we wanted to do. Tom's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope and pulled out several folded documents. The top one was a letter, handwritten on pale blue stationery. Dear Tom, though we never had the chance to meet in person, I feel I know you through David's stories. Your kindness to my husband during our darkest hours has been a gift beyond measure. David and I believe that talents like yours should be nurtured. We've established a trust fund that will provide you with enough to pursue your writing full-time for the next 3 years. The details are in the enclosed documents. Additionally, we've created a scholarship fund in your name for aspiring writers from disadvantaged backgrounds. David will help you set up the selection committee when the time is right. Use these gifts wisely. And remember the lesson you taught us, that reaching out to someone in pain can change both your lives in ways you never imagined. With gratitude and hope for your future, Linda Walsh. Tom looked up from the letter, stunned into silence. Behind it were legal documents detailing a substantial trust fund and the framework for a scholarship program. I can't accept this, he finally managed to say. It's too much, David shook his head firmly. It's already done. The papers were signed months ago. And before you argue about not deserving it, remember what I told you about the circle of care. Linda and I were blessed with more than we needed. Now it's your turn to be blessed, and someday you'll do the same for someone else. Tears filled Tom's eyes. I don't know what to say. Say you'll use it well, David replied simply. Say you'll write the stories that need to be told. Say you'll remember that sometimes the biggest changes in our lives begin with the smallest gestures. 6 months later, Tom sat in that same hospital chapel where it had all begun. The room looked exactly the same. Simple wooden benches, electric candles, the plain altar. But Tom himself was different. His first book had received glowing reviews, and he was halfway through writing his second. Thanks to the trust fund, he had left his teaching job to write full-time, though he still volunteered twice a week at the local high school's writing center. The scholarship fund was up and running too, with the first 3 recipients selected, all promising young writers who couldn't otherwise afford to pursue their craft. Tom, David, and Peter had interviewed them together, the 3 of them now a kind of unofficial family. As Tom sat quietly in the chapel, the door creaked open. A young woman entered, her face drawn with worry. She glanced at Tom briefly before taking a seat in the front row, her shoulders slumped in defeat. After a moment's hesitation, her head bowed in what might have been prayer. Tom watched her for a minute, remembering his own fear and uncertainty in this very room not so long ago. Then he stood up and moved to sit beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. She looked up, startled by his presence. I'm sorry to intrude, Tom said gently, but I was sitting here a year ago, feeling just as lost as you look right now. Sometimes it helps not to be alone. The woman studied his face for a moment, then nodded slightly. My brother, she said softly. Car accident. They don't know if he'll make it. Tom nodded, understanding her pain without needing more details. Would you like me to sit with you for a while? Yes, she whispered. Thank you. After a moment, Tom carefully offered his hand, palm up, on the bench between them, an invitation, not a demand. The woman looked at it for a long moment before slowly placing her